So thank you for making time to speak with me today. I appreciate that, Ian. And if we could just start by having you tell me a little bit about your interests in the emotional experiences of learning in general.
Hello, kitty cat. um, yeah, I mean, I grew up in a household with a mom who was a psychologist and a dad who was a school principal. So these were topics that were, often at the dinner table with us as they debriefed their day. But more specifically, after grad school in ed tech at Concordia, I got my first real instructional design job working for the Canadian Space Agency, and that was doing training for the big robot arm on the space station. So astronaut training, and it's using simulation to recreate that environment and have them go through the procedures of this very tricky instrument that they're using to build the station. Anyway, we're talking about really hyper competent learners, super learners, and I watched one of them one day smash the arm into the station, and which would have been a disaster if it hadn't been simulated. And it was something he had done earlier that day or something very similar. So there was no real good reason as to why it happened. It wasn't a lack of skill or knowledge. And when we debriefed it later on, he said something to the effect of, well, I just, I wasn't in the zone. And everybody sort of nodded, and I went, "Oh, what is the zone? What are you what are you talking about?" But I didn't bring it up. But I got a chance to talk more about it with my wife's cousin, who was an Olympic swimmer, and where we were talking, we always were interested in talking training stuff, and he talked about this as well. He talked about training to get in this, in this zone, um, and he talked about it as being the state with incredible deep focus and low anxiety, and a place where his skills just could be executed fluidly.
Mm.
And that resonated as something I think we all have access to and have experienced at different times, whether it's on the dance floor at a wedding or something, or if you're, I don't know, running or drawing or playing music, or we've all had some taste of this thing. But I thought it was exciting because this apparently is where some really good performances happen. So I guess that's kind of the background of my interest to get here. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you, Ian. And then without revealing too much, because we
Yeah.
want everybody to go ahead and read the chapter,
Oh yeah.
can you just talk a bit about how you approach that idea of the emotional experience and the zone in your chapter?
Yeah. So I broke it into three sections. The first two are really about getting into that zone and also about falling out of it. So the first part, and I really wanted the chapter for myself, at least as a learning experience, to be a way to survey the field of what was happening in terms of emotions and learning, because my background has really been in simulation based training for, well, things like Canada Arms and all the way down to submarines and everything in between. But it's always focused on the skills and the knowledge, and we kind of touch on attitudes. But this whole thing about the emotion, the affect of that moment has always been um, kind of left as an afterthought. And whereas, in sports psychology, this field I didn't really know anything about, 25 years ago, they were the same. They didn't ever talk about these things. But now they've really acknowledged that that affective state impacts performance, and therefore should be formally trained, as just as you train your body physically to get into that state, that ideal performance state that they call it. So should you also train yourself to for the head game and the heart game. And so I really enjoyed looking at sort of how they do that. It's a very personal thing. This ideal performance state is sometimes seen as somewhere between sleep and panic. It's just the right level of stimulation for you, because everybody's different, and for the task at hand. And so they really, it was interesting to see how they experiment with different things. They use tools like visualization to really experience the thing before it happens, including the feelings. They talk about using mantras, self-talk, to make sure that you've got the right messages in your head, and using breathing techniques to manage level of stress, and even music to help set the pace and set the mood. And so yeah, these are all emotional regulation techniques that they're using to help them, get in that zone. And then the flip side of that, I got to look at when the zone is disrupted. And I looked at the one example that's in there is about the European Aviation Authority. When they did a study where they realized that a majority of accidents and incidents would have had better outcomes if the pilots had been in a better state. That they suffer from, they call it startle and surprise, but I guess we all know it as kind of fight or flight, where say you're flying along at 30,000 feet and you hear a loud bang, or the instruments suddenly don't match and you don't know where you are for a moment. And they can be sort of mentally disabled momentarily, where their skills and knowledge are not accessible. Long-term memory is shot. They can hyper focus on one thing and lock out everything else, or scatter focus, where they can't even lock on to anything to start building their awareness, the negative self-talk, and all these things. So all these factors that can lead to them basically not performing the way that they were trained to, and that they seem to do well in their performance checks back in simulators and in flight training. So they really talk about, again, emotional regulation techniques. There's a method they teach which is really interesting. That is basically, as soon as there's that stimulus, that fear response, you can push yourself back into your seat, which is just a way of saying, okay, I'm starting this procedure to control my physiological and emotional state. Taking a few breaths, they check on their partner, maybe say their name, maybe touch them on the arm to kind of shake them out of that state. And then they can start, once they've kind of just lowered that panic, they can start going through the procedures and troubleshooting and the things that we actually train them for. Yeah. And then there's a third section which gets into, I just like explore how a lot of the new technologies that we have now, like virtual reality and stuff, which used to be very inaccessible, because they're now accessible. I think this whole domain of learning and emotions is now something that we can actually address. We can train for it in ways we couldn't when you had to either get a whole crew of people together, like in medical school. They would do scenarios where you have to get actors together to try to recreate that emotional environment. Well, there's examples now where they're doing, I talked to a pediatric surgeon who's doing training around pediatric trauma response, because similar to the pilots, the first time that a doctor sees a child in a traumatic state, sometimes their skills and knowledge are suddenly not available to them because they have an emotional response that's there, right? So they're using this as a way of helping people, first of all, get exposed, but also get used to the cycle of going through that experience and then doing the human debrief with the rest of the team, which includes, amongst other things, the emotional impact it had on you. So they can begin to train the cycle of going through these things, debriefing, processing emotions, and then going back and doing it again. So there's a lot of, I just am excited about how the technology has opened up a lot of possibilities for that kind of for addressing that part of of training.
Thank you. Okay, perfect. And a couple of the things I really appreciated about your chapter, one was there was a lot of real life implication to the situations that you were talking
Mm-hmm.
about. And the other was you were connecting the dots from learning to performance, to actual performance on the job, which I appreciated. I think it's so valuable. Um, what would you say for people who are going to read your chapter? What would be some of the practical implications? What are some of the takeaways that they could use in their own practice?
For me, just the process of writing it really was an opportunity to realize that we've been missing a chunk. We've been talking about skills, knowledge, and attitudes as if they're the three stools of the legs of the stool, and that was enough. And it made me really realize that this affective state is another leg, that similar to how they talk about inert knowledge, right? This idea that you can know something but not know when to use it. um, I feel that that emotional component, if you show up without that, it's the same thing. You might not be able to access your skills and knowledge. So I think, practically speaking, just even acknowledging that is a piece of the learning puzzle is really something. Um, and I think we in our personal lives, we kind of intuitively know this. If you've ever taught a grandparent to use a piece of software or a child to drive or something, you know that their state is is determines their readiness to learn and to perform. Um, in the article itself, practically, I tried to sort of tie some of this concept of ideal performance state to Bandura's self-efficacy model, right? Which is your belief in a moment that you're going to be able to actually do what you want to do. And I think there's some nice parallels in there to consider. So things like seeing other people like you do the thing that you're about to do and seeing them achieve it, you know, increases your feeling that you'll be able to do it. The verbal encouragement part, which is all part of good coaching already. Um, but acknowledging that things are hard as well. So even in the pilot example I gave, one thing they did is try to destigmatize the uh, uh, freezing, right? That yeah, yes, you're a pilot and you're super capable, but people freeze and it happens. And incorporating a lot of those stress management techniques. So I think that you know whether you're flying an aircraft or you're working at a burger joint, you're going to encounter stressful situations. And until now, I feel at least in the field that I've seen, we've not acknowledged these very much because we figure you're just gonna we'll train you for that moment when you start performing, but then there's this gap between the moment that I don't know a customer shouts at you or and when you actually get to use your skills. So I think just a sensitivity to bringing some of these elements in, creating the conditions where people can function well and avoid getting knocked out. So I do sprinkle some of those types of tips throughout the article.
Perfect. Thank you, Ian, so much. I really appreciate that.